Welcome to this IRM webinar on risk reporting. My name is Simon Ashby and I'll be bringing my experience in the field in today's webinar. I am an academic specialising in risk management, but I've also been a head of risk management, developing risk reports, plus I chair an audit and risk committee, so I have experience not only in developing reports, but also in using reports as a board member. Today's webinar builds on a risk reporting training day that the IRM offers, and there'll be more details about that training at the end of the session. So if we start, I'm going to focus today on three elements. Firstly, how to get more value from your risk reporting. Risk reporting can sometimes be something of a kind of procedural exercise, something you do perhaps because other organisations do it. And we'll look at how you can perhaps get more from your risk reporting, start to use it more as a decision-making tool, a tool for management, rather than just the output of a risk process. We'll also look at some common tools, common reporting tools that you can use and their strengths and weaknesses. Key issue here is that there is no one right answer. What works best for one organisation will not necessarily be what's best for another. And then finally, we'll look at how you can get some more value from your risk reporting tools. And I'll make sure that at the end there's plenty of time for questions and answers. So if we focus first on the value of risk reporting. Now I've got a little poll for you. If you kind of scroll, you should see on the, I think the right-hand side of your screen, there'll be a little poll screen, votes from the audience. And I'll explain what I mean by principled and prescriptive before I ask you to vote on that poll. Now, the key message in this slide is that there's no magic bullet in terms of risk reporting. There's no one perfect approach to reporting your risks. Different organizations will want to implement different types of risk reporting, depending on whether they are more principled in their approach to risk management or whether they are more prescriptive in their approach to risk management. Now, in terms of principled, what I'm thinking about here is organizations that are perhaps more less formal in their approach to risk management. So reporting in a more principle-based organization, reporting would be more around conversations about risk. You know, what would happen if X or Y was to occur in the future. And they tend to be less structured. They tend to use less formal risk management language. But one of the advantages of a principled approach is that it can facilitate more creativity. It can be more effective when you're dealing with high levels of uncertainty, political uncertainty, for example, as we're experiencing in the UK at the moment. And it can also be good in more kind of creative type industries. So the principled approach is less formal, more about conversations about risk, not necessarily using the word risk, but certainly conversations around what would happen if this outcome was to occur, or if that outcome was to occur, how would we go about it? On the other side, we have a more prescriptive-based approach. A more prescriptive-based approach. Now, that approach is one that will be more common in, for example, areas like financial services, where we are dealing sometimes with perhaps more known and understood risks. We're perhaps in a more regulated environment, and there's a need to have a more kind of procedural approach, a more kind of formulaic perhaps approach to risk and risk reporting. Now, that's not to say that that approach isn't necessarily, isn't a bad approach. It can be a very effective approach where, of course, you want to ensure that you're not going to miss key risks, where you want to ensure that you're going to meet key regulatory requirements. So I'd be interested in people's perspectives on this. If you can see the audience vote screen, there is a little poll. Is your risk reporting more formal and prescriptive or informal and principled? So just have a quick reflect and see where you feel you are on that spectrum. Are you formal in your approach? Do you have formal risk reports? Or is it more around conversations around risk and risk management? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to reflect on that and vote. I'm not sure if it's working, but if it is, please do start voting. Here we go. I think I've started it. So while you're thinking about that and while you're hopefully voting on that, excellent, we're getting some votes through now. The second element here on this slide is around proactive and passive in your approach. So I can see now, looking at the vote, we now have 70% formal and prescriptive, 30% informal and principled, changing slightly, but we're seeing some differences there. And as I said before, the important thing to stress is that one isn't better than the other. In different industries, in different sectors, one approach will be preferred to the other approach. So if you've got formal and prescriptive, that doesn't mean to say that you should be more principled in your approach. If you've got informal and principled, that doesn't necessarily mean to say you should be more formal and prescriptive, unless, of course, you're in an industry where that is the kind of the norm. But another area where I think many organizations often struggle is on this proactive passive spectrum. A lot of risk reporting that we see today can be quite passive, quite backward looking, often quite defensive in its approach. So it's more about saying, look, we did this, we assessed these risks. If something then goes wrong, don't blame us because we've done all we could, to manage the risk effectively. And it's a bit like when I see my students going to lectures. Sometimes, you see them kind of crossing the road, and often they don't look back at what the traffic was doing until they've actually crossed the road. So they kind of cross the road and then look back to see what nearly hit them. And that, I think, is one of the problems with a more passive, backward-looking approach to risk reporting. And, of course, as we know, a lot of risk reporting can be quite backward-looking. So there's also, I think, a need to extract maximum value from your risk reporting to be more proactive, more forward-looking in terms of risk. What are the risks and also what are the opportunities that are on the horizon? Yes, that can include thinking about emerging risks, but it can also include obviously thinking about very real, tangible risks that exist, but which perhaps could affect your organisation some way down the line. And I've just got some key points on the next slide to emphasise that. The first thing is it's important to get the most value from your risk reporting, to have reports that help you look forward, to discuss and to prepare for potential threats and opportunities. Running a business, whether commercial or non-commercial, is a bit like, I think, driving a car with a blindfold on. You're trying to look ahead, and identify potential threats and opportunities without a clear picture of what those threats and opportunities might be. So the more you can look forward, the more you can kind of look through that blindfold, not just look in your rearview mirror, but look forward, look at what's happening in your industry, in your sector, potential risks in the future. The more effective will be your risk reporting, because it will help management to prepare for the future. Secondly, to focus on reports that support decision making. I've seen in my experience developing reports and using reports, I've seen a lot of reports developed by risk experts who, have developed reports that they think people want. So they're perhaps sometimes developing very lengthy reports or very technical reports that may be brilliant in terms of their content, in terms of their design, but if they're not understood by decision makers effectively, if they're not used to support effective decision making, then even those brilliantly well-designed reports will very quickly prove to be ineffective. And you often see this, and I've seen this in some organizations where their reporting is almost in a constant state of flux, because the risk management function or the risk experts are designing reports, but they're not really fulfilling the needs of the business. And so you're kind of constantly trying out new things and new ideas, or constantly tweaking those reports. But that's not necessarily a good approach, because you haven't necessarily got something that people are using to support their decision making effectively. Other thing to stress is that reports should not just be for internal control purposes. Clearly, internal control, governance is an important part of effective risk management, but also we need reports that can help businesses make effective strategic decisions, to spot opportunities and to exploit those opportunities down the line. One organization I know, for example, it had a risk reporting, and the key part of its risk reporting was political risk. And this was a company that had business interests in America, and they were concerned at the time, or aware at the time, that Trump might well become president, and their risk reporting was focusing on this potential. Now, rather than, of course, just focus on the negatives from that, what they did was they made the decision at the time to develop a new subsidiary actually in the United States of America. So, in the event that there were trade wars or tariffs or other potential impediments to their business, they could, of course, get around that with their in-country subsidiary. So they turned what could have been for their business a potential negative into a positive by exploiting the strategic, opportunities from that, early understanding, that early warning about what could happen in the future. So looking to the future, looking to what might happen and preparing for it today. And then finally, we need reports, or nearly finally, reports that are meaningful for and understood by stakeholders. Again, this comes back to the point of having reports that, while they may be designed by experts, they're not going to be used by experts. So you've got to be mindful of your audience and what your audience is going to understand and what your audience is going to be able to use for effective decision-making purposes. And the final point there is recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this. Different organizations are going to want different types of reporting. Okay, so that's just the start. We'll come back to value at the end of the presentation. And again, I've got some further points on how you can extract more value from the reporting tools that we're going to talk about now. Now, obviously, this is a relatively short webinar, so we can't go through a full kind of spectrum of tools. So what I've done is I'm focused on 3 of the most common, I think, reporting tools that we come across in most businesses, and we'll be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of those tools to kind of set the scene for how we can get more value, extract more value from those tools going forward. Okay, so firstly, risk registers. Now, I haven't done a poll for this because I suspect that 99% of you all make use of risk registers. I've not, in my experience, come across an organization, at least a medium to large organization, that didn't have or didn't use some form of risk register, whether that be for health and safety only or whether it be for a wider range of risks, including these days, not just kind of, if you like, operational risks or the kind of the more conventional risks that we might think about, but also these days you will often see risk registers for strategic risks, so effectively board level registers looking at both threats and increasingly opportunities for the business. And of course, one of the benefits of risk registers is that they're very easy to design. We have, of course, we can simply use spreadsheets to do a risk register, or even, you know, and even word processing application. So they're very quick, they're very easy to do. Of course, there are organizations out there, companies out there that offer more sophisticated versions of risk registers using a variety of databases. And they may not quite look like a risk register, but they're still effectively doing the same thing. They're still collecting information on the level of exposure, so the probability and impact of a risk, possibly both on an inherent without controls basis or a residual with controls basis. They may be collecting information about controls and the effectiveness of those controls, probably identifying risk owners and possibly even including action plans and all sorts of other things. But so, you know, one risk register in one organization may look very different to another organization. So they can be very flexible, very easy to design. But one of the big problems in my experience with risk registers is that they can take a long time to do properly. In one organization where I was the head of risk, we implemented a new risk register approach, new departmental risk register approach, and it took me 6 months to roll that out. It was new to everybody, so I had to go around each different department and talk to the relevant people and work with them to populate the risk register. So, you know, by the time we populated this risk register after 6 months, everything was out of date. You know, but you know, it took us 6 months before we had the energy to look at it again. And that's one of the big problems with risk registers. They can take a lot of time to do properly. There's also, of course, the problem of missing risks. How can you be sure that you have captured everything that you need on your risk register? There's absolutely no guarantee that you will have everything, and it's probably the risks that aren't captured on the register that will be the ones that you really need to think about. Actually, this is one of the key problems of a prescriptive approach, because if you have a prescriptive approach to risk reporting, you might use some you know, risk register or have a formal kind of risk categorization framework. But there's a very, you know, real possibility that you will miss something, particularly some kind of new risk or some area of risk that's not well defined yet. And that's where a principle-based approach can be particularly useful, because it's encouraging conversations about risk. You know, what if this, what if that, can be more creative, and there's perhaps greater chance that you will identify those kind of more extreme outcomes out of those conversations. So that's the problem of missing risks. You know, if your risk register misses something that's particularly key, and then that risk crystallizes for your organization, clearly you've got a problem. I should say, please do keep questions coming. I'm not ignoring those questions, though. I will cover your questions at the end of the session. So if, as I'm talking, you have questions, please do write them down, and I will look at them. I can see currently we have 3 questions. Please do write some more as they occur to you. The third issue there is, of course, is the size of risk registers. One organization I worked with had a risk register that had well over 1,000 risks on it. Now, you might say, well, that's good. They captured a wide range of risks, and that's true. They had indeed captured a very wide range of risks. But of course, when you've got 1,000 risks on your register, it's impossible to see the wood, you know, for the trees. I mean, there's so many different things captured on that register. How can you potentially identify what are the key issues, what are the key themes that you need to focus on as an organization. Now, a common reason why risk registers can be very long is that they tend to be event-based. So you might talk about a fire event or a theft event or a fraud event, or a cybercrime event or a political event. And of course, there are many different types of those events as well. There's internal fraud, there's external fraud, there's big fires, there's little fires, there's all sorts of, big thefts, little thefts. So there's a range of possible events that you might want to think about, even within those broad categories. So, risk registers can sometimes get very large, especially when they are event-based. And I've got another slide just to explain what I mean here. And of course, we're all familiar with the fact that, most risks are a function of three things. There's causes, the things that cause risk events like a fire or a fraud to occur. And then, of course, there's the effects of that risk event as well that follow from the event. Now, risk registers, of course, are focusing on that central theme there. They're usually focusing on events. And as I said already, there are literally thousands of different events that could occur, for any one organization. So there is a danger that, of course, that we end up with very large registers with lots of different events. Of course, what we also find is that, events tend to be connected. One event may be related to another event. And of course, those events tend to be connected through their causes. And actually, although there may be thousands of different events, what you tend to find is that there's only really a small number of causes and a small number of effects. So around causes, broadly speaking, I think you could argue there's four main types of cause for risk events. One, of course, is people, and that might be people doing things they shouldn't do. It might be people making mistakes. It might be, lack of training, or it might be that we haven't got enough people, so they're overstretched. Processes, of course, as well. Of course, people use processes, but also we're talking about how processes are designed, or we're talking about potential weaknesses in processes. Systems, again, how they're designed, potential weaknesses, and of course external events, whether they be political or environmental or economic. These things can also, of course, be a key cause of risk events. On the effects side, we have of course human effects to people. We have, of course, effects to resources, to our assets, and to our finances, and of course we have reputation effects as well. And as I say, with risk registers focusing on risk events, you may not be able to make connections between, as effective connections between those events and the causes and the effects of those risks, of how they might affect your organisation or what might cause them. And actually, I think it would be interesting to see, and I have personally tried to do this myself. It'd be interesting to see registers that were less event focused and actually more around the causes and the effects of risk events. It is possible to change the emphasis of your registers to think more about causes and effects. And actually, technology can be a key enabler for that as well, which we'll come on to towards the end of the presentation. So if we move on then to another type of tool, and that, of course, is one that I suspect many of you use, and that, of course, is red, amber, green, or RAG reporting. Now, a key benefit of RAG reporting, here are just some examples of RAG reports, is that they're an easy way to summarize information. Risk registers can, of course, sometimes include an element of RAG reporting. You may decide to add some color around your risk and control assessments in your risk register to try and make them more digestible, so the reader can focus obviously on the areas that are red, but it's also, of course, common to create more consolidated red, amber, green reports like the examples that we have here. And one of the, of course, as I say, one of the key benefits of RAG reports is that can be used to provide a simple summary. Everybody, I think, is culturally now in most countries, in many countries, clued into the notion of red, amber, and green. You know, red obviously meaning stop, amber meaning caution, and green meaning kind of go. So it's a simple visual summary. Many people like that, particularly time pressured. As a board member, for example, you know, my time is limited. So, you know, I find, you know, RAG type reports very helpful because I can focus on the things that are red or the things that are amber, and you know, I can devote my time to those. And you know, even with relatively large amounts of data, it can focus the eye on, you know, what may require more attention. But yet again, one of the problems with RAG reports, and you've seen that on some of the examples, if we just quickly go back, you know, you see this on some of the examples that there are. I'll just quickly go back to that. You know, some of these get very complicated visually. You know, where do you focus the eye in terms of, you know, the reds or the ambers or the greens? So, you know, these larger reports can get quite complicated. Another key point is, you know, the reader may struggle to, obviously, to know where to look, where there's a complicated report where there's lots of red or lots of amber or lots of green, is, of course, how have you come up with that red and that amber and that green? How have you come up with the thresholds to denote it? And, of course, subjective human judgment is a key element there. Who's decided what's red? Who's decided what's amber? And how have they decided that? Has it been, for example, linked to your risk appetite if you have a stated appetite for risk? Obviously, today we haven't got time to talk about risk appetite, but you know, there's a lot of questions there. You know, I as a board member may focus on those reds, but you know, how have those reds been determined? Are they really red? Are they really something that should concern me, or is the threshold too optimistic? You know, I was actually, you know, something amber might be so serious it requires my attention. So that can be a problem with these reports too. Who's decided and how have they decided what should be red and what should be amber? And finally, of course, you know, they're simple, and that's one of the benefits. It's a simple picture. But what's the narrative? You know, what do we mean by this has gone red or that's now amber? You know, is that something that's significant? Is it likely to stay red? Is it likely to stay amber? Is it likely to get worse? Is it likely to get better? Is it temporary? Is it more permanent? So the need, I think, often for narrative. Also, for example, is something red because a strategic decision has been made to exploit particular opportunities, which might require an organisation to take a bit more risk for, you know, a period of time. So is that risk being taken, you know, knowingly in the desire to exploit other benefits for the organisation? All of that, I think, is the kind of thing that needs to be included within some kind of narrative to accompany a red, amber, green report to, you know, help people to make sense of the picture. And the final area that I wanted to talk about is risk metrics. I suspect many of you use risk metrics. You may do so formally as part of your risk management process. You may do so less formally or on a more ad hoc basis. So I see many, for example, I talk to many people that say to me, oh, we don't have risk metrics. But then I'll say to them, well, what does your IT function do, for example? Oh, well, they have metrics on, you know, hacking attacks, or they have metrics on viruses. Well, they, of course, are risk metrics. You will always have, of course, financial metrics around profit and turnover. Now, of course, these metrics have a key financial and accounting role, but they also are very valuable from a risk perspective too. So most organisations actually do collect and report on risk metrics, even if it's not part of a formal kind of risk management process. Now, the key benefit of metrics is that they provide, of course, or hopefully they provide information on the level, but also the direction of our risk exposure. So hopefully metrics are telling us not just what's happening today, but what's happening in the future, what could be, a problem for us in the future. If you're looking at your speed in the car, that current speed is not just if you like, an example of kind of your current exposure, but it's also an example of your future exposure. If you're going too fast, if you're not reducing that speed now, then you've got a potential risk in the future. So metrics should hopefully show us, what's going to happen in terms of risk, in terms of our exposure to risk, not just today, but also what's going to happen tomorrow, the day after, and hopefully some months or years after that as well. Now, metrics, of course, tend to be quantitative. That word metric is, it does imply quantitative. As I say, they're often financial kind of metrics, loss data, data about risk events that have happened in the past, financial data, data about staff turnover, for example. These are quantitative things. But increasingly now, organisations are beginning to use more qualitative metrics. Some of you, for example, may have had done staff surveys to look at kind of staff opinion, staff morale. And as part of that, you may also have had some questions around culture and risk culture, for example. As you will probably know, the Institute of Risk Management has done work on risk culture in the past. And those kind of surveys, staff surveys, are, of course, a more qualitative indicator. Staff opinion, staff morale, staff awareness of risk, for example. Metrics are starting to be collected on areas like that too. And these are, as I say, much more qualitative indicators. Some organisations even look to collect information on staff kind of attitudes to risk. Are people kind of more risk averse? Are people more risk preferring? And again, that can be very useful metric information for an organisation to understand, whether there's potential for excessive risk taking down the line. In areas like trading, for example, financial market trading, some organisations do this. They're kind of monitoring the risk attitudes, the behaviour of staff to try and manage it. Other organisations I know record phone calls, particularly for compliance monitoring purposes, to check, for example, that key compliance kind of information and is covered on calls. And again, that's a more kind of qualitative type of metric. Now, in terms of metrics, broadly speaking, there's three types that you may be using. There, of course, are risk indicators. These are indicators usually of inherent risk. So they give you an idea in terms of whether the basic level of risk is increasing or reducing. So we're talking about things there like sort of staff turnover as a metric. That's quite a good inherent risk metric. High levels of staff turnover implies, of course, lower levels of staff morale. It may mean that you've got new staff who aren't as well trained, more likely to make mistakes, for example. So we have risk indicators that give us kind of, if you like, base information about our kind of inherent exposure to risk. Then we have control indicators, so indicators usually around the effectiveness of our control. So is a control effective or not? So it might be, are staff up to date in terms of their kind of Windows technology training? Are our business continuity plans, kept up to date? Has our electrical system been tested properly on time, etc. So these are kind of control indicators that you could use. And of course, control indicators are giving you information about how effective your controls are, which of course is giving you more information about your residual exposure to risk, the level of risk given the controls and the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place. And then finally, of course, we have performance indicators, financial information, for example, rate of company growth, rate of company debt, gearing, those kind of indicators, or indicators around productivity rates, for example, or call center kind of, answering rates and so on. Now, of course, these are often looked at from a performance perspective, but they can be very relevant from a risk perspective too. For example, the rate of company growth, so sudden big increase in turnover, financial turnover, for example. Very good, of course, from a financial performance perspective, but of course that's also a potential issue from a risk perspective, because if a company is growing fast, then maybe its systems and its controls are not keeping up with that performance improvement. So performance indicators can also be very relevant from a risk management perspective. And the final point on that slide, of course, is that indicators may or may not be what we call key risk indicators. Most organizations will monitor a range of metrics, and those metrics may not be key risk or key control or key performance indicators. Generally speaking, an indicator is key either when it's connected to a very key risk for the organization, so one that's very significant in terms of strategic or in terms of kind of solvency or compliance for the organization. So an indicator might be key where it's connected to a key risk, or it may be where an indicator is a particularly good predictor of your exposure to a specific type of risk. So metrics are key if they're linked to key risks, or if those metrics are particularly good predictors of particular types of risk. Now, many of you may have already key risk indicator and etc. Monitoring, and of course that kind of monitoring can be very effective, gives you hopefully a real-time or more real-time indicator of your exposure to risk. But as you will know, if you try to do it, it can be very hard to select the right indicators. You don't want too many. I mean, this comes into the next problem. You don't want too many, but you don't want too few indicators. So what are the best indicators that you might need? And the key point there actually is that don't choose one set of indicators and then think that's going to be the right set for now and forevermore. Indicators will become more or less useful as your exposures to risk changes. So, as the nature of your business changes, as the business environment changes, as the decisions change, so too will the best combination of indicators. So what I would always say here is that once you've selected at least an initial set of metrics, don't be afraid to change that, develop that, refine it over time. But don't also be tempted just to add and not subtract, because if you keep adding and you keep adding new indicators, it can get to the point again where you have a wood for the trees problem. People simply won't be able to make sense of all of those indicators. One organization I worked for was doing risk metric reporting, and every month a small book of metrics was produced. And quite honestly, nobody had the time to digest and to understand all of those indicators. And finally, you can also be presentational problems too. I've got just an example of a kind of, sometimes people talk about metric dashboards, for example, And of course, those dashboards can work fine where they're relatively simple. But again, as you add more and more metrics to your dashboard, it can become very difficult to make sense of it. So my experience, actually, a simple approach here is generally best. A small number of indicators, and keep your reporting as simple as possible. So this is just an example of the kind of thing that I've implemented in the past. Very simple directional arrows to show whether the risk is increasing or reducing or staying the same. And those arrows are color-coded to show whether we're in the red or the amber threshold, for example. And then added to that is some narrative, again, just to reinforce the value and the importance of having narrative to help people understand risks and their exposure to risk. So my advice with metrics would always be keep it simple, simple visuals, and add to that some narrative to highlight more the detail that people need to focus on for decision-making purposes. Okay, so final element before we move to questions is how you can extract more value from reporting. And I just want to focus on two things here and I also don't want to get too technical, although one of those things is on the more technical side. The two things I want to talk about is firstly the role of the risk function, and then secondly using technology or thinking about using technology to help you extract more value. So firstly then, the role of the risk function. And I invite you, again, I haven't got a poll, but I invite you just to have a look on this and think about where you fit on this spectrum. And I see even today organisations on this spectrum less and less now. Luckily, I see them at the bottom end, which is where the risk function produces the reports itself for compliance purposes. So, reports are purely produced by the risk function, and I call that the kind of black box approach, because, how is the risk function producing those reports? What information is the risk function using to produce those reports? And certainly in the early days, it was really more about the opinions of the risk function. Secondly, of course, and many, I think, organisations are at this level of maturity, we have, of course, the risk function working as a business partner. So the risk function is working with the business and helping the business to assess and monitor and control risk. But reports still kind of flow upwards. So the business may be providing the information to the risk function, but that information is processed by the risk function, used for oversight purposes, used for internal control purposes, and then, reports are produced to senior management and the board. And those reports are often, of course, again, produced by the risk function. This time, which is good, using information provided by the business, but reports, reporting is still very much focused on the risk function, and the risk function kind of collating information and passing it up the line, which is in effect a black hole approach. And many people I speak to that have this approach say that the business can in time get quite tired providing all of the information that's required, because they don't see any benefits from it for themselves. We're providing all this information to you, you're reporting that up to the board, that's great, but what's in it for me? Why am I doing this? This is getting in the way of my day job. So what we're now beginning to see, and research is showing this, and my own experience, I think, highlights this as well, is that the risk function could be most effective and help the organisation to extract more value from its risk reporting, where it works as a facilitator, where it's working with the business, it's helping the business to manage its risks, and it's helping to achieve, local level benefits from that risk management, and it's actually helping management itself, in the first line, in the front line of the business. It's actually helping management itself to produce its own reports for its own purposes. So you're less of a kind of overseer in this function. You're more of a consultant. You're more of a facilitator. You're actually saying to the business, where are your problems, where are your issues, and how can we help from a risk perspective to solve those problems and issues. So working more as a facilitator, less as a kind of overseer, less as a kind of sucker up of information, and more as a facilitator of reporting across the business. And then finally, I just wanted to reflect very briefly on the technology side of the equation. Now, I recently visited an organization that is trying to automate its reporting. It's going through a very detailed risk assessment and risk reporting process. It's very time consuming. They're mapping their processes. They're identifying their controls. They're assessing the effectiveness of their controls. And the ultimate aim is to automate. So they have algorithms, artificially intelligent algorithms going in, mining data, using big data principles, and doing that so that their reporting can be more kind of agile. And the idea is that it would be more like we have now on some cars and on planes, for example. We have a kind of head-up display almost, where the artificially intelligent algorithms are mining data, are looking for patterns in data, seeing how one type of risk relates to another type of risk, how one cause relates to another cause, to build up a bigger picture of, what might hurt or the organization in the future, or what might be a big opportunity for the organization in the future, and adjusting reporting and reporting different things at different times depending on when they might be needed. And this, I think this is important, and there are many, I think, consultants trying to sell this kind of automation of risk reporting, and I think there are many benefits of it, but it can only work effectively, I think, when combined with a risk function that acts as a facilitator. If you allow this to happen without effective intervention and support from the risk function, then it's not going to work. So for me, the best way to extract value from risk reporting is through human and human intervention and a key facilitation role for the risk function, combined with technological solutions that help organizations to cope with the mass of information that they have. If you've got a risk register with 1,000 risk events on it, how can you see all of that? Well, you can't. But if you can use technology to help you monitor a wide range of metrics and look for patterns in those metrics, then that technology can hopefully identify, well, actually, of these 1,000 risk events, it's this one that matters to you this month, or it's that one that's going to be an issue for you next month. So you're using that technology to help you identify, where you need to focus your attention. But you're doing that from a kind of, a mindful human perspective, where you're not just slavishly listening to the computer. There are experts that are working, with the system and with the business to help identify what those things are. So a few kind of golden rules on that to conclude. The first thing is, of course, be prepared. So look to the future. Risk reporting needs to look to the future. Good reporting, if you're doing your reporting effectively, you will be stimulating discussion. You will be helping people to talk about future threats and future opportunities for the business. And that's really what it's all about. What's on the horizon, what could affect you, down the line, and how can you prepare for that effectively? Customize. So, don't let somebody tell you what your reporting should look like. Decide as an organization what a good report looks like, and make sure you do that in consultation with stakeholders. Make sure that your reporting is understood, is valued by them. Give people options. It's fair to say you can't simply go to the business and say, what do you want? You've got to give them options, I think, as a risk function. But don't just present a straw man and think that's going to be good enough. involve the business, involve other stakeholders in the design of effective risk reports. Definitely don't overcomplicate. Some of the best reporting I've seen is incredibly simple. Very simple kind of reports, narrative-based reports, like, for example, the metric reporting that I presented earlier. You might think, oh, that's a bit simple, but that doesn't matter. If it encourages the right level of debate, then that's what you need. And don't be tempted to over-report. I think the best reports are 1 or 2 pages long often. And then finally, of course, remember that reporting is a means to an end. It might be a key output for you in terms of as a practicing risk manager, but of course for other people it's just an input into the process. Okay, so that's just a few key conclusions. We'll move now to questions and answers, and you've given me a range of questions, and I'll try and get through as many of those questions as I can. As I do that, I'll just in case people go off the call, just to remind you that this webinar is really just a taster for a more detailed day that the Institute of Risk Management offers on risk reporting. The next one, should you be interested, it is quite soon, the 22nd of January, and there is a discount for anybody that wants to sign up to that course. Today there are still some places, but book early to obviously avoid disappointment, and it will be me taking you on that day, developing some of the themes that we've been discussing in the webinar, but also extending that, of course, as we go through the day. Okay, so let's go to some of the questions that you've got, and I'll take these in order that they've appeared on my screen. So the first question here is, we've not heard much on aligning reporting to business strategy. How would you see good reporting informing board decisions effectively? So very good question. I think boards, of course, are a key user of risk reports. I think with board reporting, whether it's strategic level reporting or internal control reporting, you need to keep it simple. The average board member will probably only spend 2 to 3 hours going through board papers. So if you provide them with a lengthy, detailed report, then of course that's not something that they're going to look at very effectively. So keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Involve the board actually in strategic level connections between risk and strategy if you can. One thing that I've done as a board director, is we've had board away days. And what we've done in those board away days is we take an hour out to talk about risk and strategy. One thing we did recently, for example, is that we invited the board to talk about 2 potential risks for our business, key strategic risks for our business going forward. One, of course, was the B word, Brexit, which presents both risks, threats and opportunities to our business. And the other was cyber risk, again, threats and opportunities. You know, we as a business, we need to make more use of cyber technology, of web interfaces, for example, for our customers. But of course, with that comes risks. So the board was encouraged to discuss and debate what those risks might be. So involve the board in that process. And key there, I think, is to combine strategy and risk conversations. So the board doesn't have a separate conversation about strategy and then a separate conversation about risk. You encourage the board to talk about both together. From a technical perspective, I think a really good tool that you can use to help boards make connections is the both high analysis that obviously gets them to think about causes and effects in connection to risk events, but I haven't got time to discuss that further. Okay, so next question. What is the best approach to get a more facilitative approach with the business units? What techniques, tips do you have to really get them engaged and help give them insight into what the function of risk is and the value is it to them? I think the key thing there is to work with the business. One very simple approach is think about where your risk function is located. I see many risk functions that are put in separate rooms or separate floors from the rest of the business. And actually, it's often better if the risk function is more embedded into the wider business. So if you're open plan, make sure your risk function is right at the heart of the business, and so that people can have simple conversations at the water, at the water fountain, water cooler, coffee machine, about what they're doing and risk and so on. So that can be one simple thing to do. Think about where the function is located. I think also what you need to do is you need to develop that kind of an approach of kind of a relationship management approach, so that you're regularly meeting the business. So perhaps that could mean regular monthly meetings with key people across the business to talk about the work that they're doing and how the risk function can help them in that work. That I think can be very key, because you can look at things that are happening in the future, and then how can the risk function help in terms of the future. We see a lot, and I talked to one business recently that had a situation where the risk function, approved products. So they had them, the business would develop a product, and then it would go to the risk function for approval. And of course, if the risk function didn't like it, they would go not approved, and that would delay a product. So what they've done now is they've instigated the process where the risk function is actually involved right from the start of the product approval process, so that they get involved in the initial design of the product right at the beginning. And that way, of course, you don't have a situation where, the product's developed and then suddenly it gets scuppered by a risk at the last moment. So it is about, I think, it's about those touch points. It's about regular contact with the business and helping the business where possible. Okay, next question. Where the risk function is a facilitator and the business develops its own reporting, how have you seen this work in a group that needs to be able to consolidate the risk picture? Yeah, I mean, that's a real tricky one in terms of consolidation. There's a danger, of course, that you try and average out all of those reports, and then, of course, you kind of lose meaningful information. What I would say there is I think there's sometimes a need for the risk function to play a key role in translating. So you might be looking at different departmental risk reports, and then, of course, you've got to try and combine that into one group-wide report. So you've got to kind of, I think, reflect on what's key for the whole organisation, talk to senior management about what's key, and come up with a kind of consolidated report that actually uses your own expertise around what do you see as the key issues. As an example there, one area that I often see the business not underestimating is cyber risk, for example, and then the IT function can overestimate it. So you as a kind of risk expert have got to kind of come in and provide a kind of individual perspective. A couple more questions before we're out of time. Is the RAG status and risk metrics not similar in the content? Can they be used independently or together? Yeah, very much they can be used together. You can use RAG reporting for your risk metrics, and indeed I would encourage you to do so. What I would say there, though, is that I would start collecting a risk metric and collect the information for a number of months before you try and RAG rate it. That way you'll get a chance to see what's kind of normal and what's perhaps less normal in terms of the indicators. But yes, very much they can be combined. Is there any case studies of organisations which have really nailed their approach to risk reporting that you would recommend? Well, actually, I encourage you to look at some work that I'm doing currently, and I can in due course provide more information about this. I'm currently doing some research with the Association of Certified Chartered Accountants on risk reporting. They do already have some information on good risk reporting on their website, but in the not too distant future, we'll be publishing another report in April, hopefully, on case studies of organisations that are using risk reporting effectively. So watch this space. I will make sure that the Institute of Risk Management is aware of that, and indeed hope to work with them on it a little bit in the not too distant future. So please look out for the ACCA report coming soon on risk reporting. Couple more questions before we finish. You forgot the only important part about integrating risk information into existing performance reporting. Everything else is window dressing. Yeah, I would absolutely agree that risk information, the existing performance reporting is key and is something that is going to give you useful risk information. I would certainly recommend, if you're developing risk metrics, that you start by looking at what you're already reporting around performance reporting and decide, of course, which metrics could be useful from a risk management perspective. So I would certainly agree with that. Apologies if people, I think most people are okay in terms of sound, so I'll just ignore that. A couple more questions. What else do we have here? Some quick questions. Should risks only focus on the macro level rather than the micro level? Well, I would say that that risks should look both at the macro and the micro level. Risk reporting is going to have different audiences. So you're going to do macro level reporting for the board, absolutely, and they're going to want to know what's happening in terms of the broader macro environment and strategic implications of that. But the rest of the business, of course, are going to have more micro level concerns around efficiency, effectiveness, things like call centers, customer complaints, or whatever it might be. And certainly, I think your reporting has got to address both. I would always recommend having different reports. So design different reports for different audiences and different purposes to make sure that that they are effective. Okay, couple more quick questions before we draw things to a close. Do companies report both inherent and residual risk, or is one favoured more than others? Many organisations do both, so they report both inherent and residual. From my perspective, I think the most important one is, if you're only going to do one, I would say do residual, because of course that's the real risk, that's the risk that's affecting your business today. So I would generally recommend that you focus on residual risk. Now, I think we're pretty much out of time now, so apologies if your question hasn't been answered. But again, I would encourage you, if you do want more answers, to attend the training course that's on the 22nd of January. So please, if you want to learn more, come to the training course. Equally, if I haven't, and my apologies if I haven't answered your question today, because we didn't have time for all of the questions. Thank you very much for so many questions. There are about 30 questions that people ask, so I hope you can appreciate that it's not going to be possible to answer all of those 30 or so questions. I've done my best. But thank you so much. If I haven't answered your question, please do feel free to email me. My contact details are on this final slide. Email me your question. Email me other questions that you might have about risk reporting. The reason I do these webinars is to obviously learn from other people about what they are doing. So I would very much be pleased to hear from you if you do have those questions. So that is the end of our webinar today. Please do remember, if you have colleagues that you think should listen to this webinar, it has of course been recorded, and they can listen to it via the IRM's website. And of course, if you wish to listen to the webinar again, you too can listen to it via the website. So I wish you all a happy new year and a successful 2019 in terms of your risk reporting. So thank you all very much. Goodbye.